So let's get it going. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another session of the Douglas County Behavioral Health Prevention Summit. My name is Lydia Fuqua. I'll be your moderator today. Today's session is You're a Lifesaver, Suicide Prevention for Educators. I'm going to introduce our speaker soon, but first I just have a couple of reminders for you. This session is being recorded, as you heard it be announced just a moment ago. All the sessions will be available to view by October 22nd. I will send those out via email. We want to hear from you during the session. You can type questions or comments in the chat box. We do ask that you keep yourself muted unless Monica asks otherwise. You also want to watch the chat for information related to CEUs, and you'll receive a follow-up email about that as well. I think those are all the announcements I have. So with that, I'm super duper excited to introduce Monica Kurz, who is the Vice President of External Programming with the Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ. Monica, thank you so much for being here to share with us. We're super excited to hear from you today. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lydia. As Lydia said, my name is Monica Kurz, and I am seeing a lot of familiar names on the webinar today, and so that's very, very exciting. But for those of you that I have not met, I am with the Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ, maybe formerly known as Headquarters Counseling Center for those of you who are from the Douglas County area. We have been in the area operating a crisis line for like the last 50 years. So we actually started in 1969 and have been really kind of dedicated to supporting folks in crisis and suicide prevention since that time. So I am really pleased to be at the Behavioral Health Summit today, thinking about the kind of role that educators can play in suicide prevention, because I think, as you'll see as we go along, one of our really core beliefs at KSPHQ is that everybody has a part to play in suicide prevention. And so I've been lucky enough in my career to get to do that in a number of different ways. I started on the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline as a volunteer counselor in 2005. I like to say that they haven't figured out how to get rid of me yet at KSPHQ, because I've been around in some form or another since then. So I started training our volunteer counselors in 2014 and joined the staff full-time in 2017. Kind of in between that time, I actually did quite a bit of work in community mental health settings, in particular with adults with severe and persistent mental illness. So, and have some experience also doing some crisis work with regards to like emergency department screens. So have gotten to see this work from kind of a few different sides. And as I said, I think that what my experience has really taught me is that there are skills that we can all learn, and there are things that we can all do. And I'm looking at the chat and feeling very excited about a former coworker who is also here joining us today. So hello to Jenna. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll dive into some of the content that I brought with me today. I say brought with me, I'm in my basement, like, let's be very honest. So Lydia and the other folks from DECA are going to kind of help me monitor the chat. If you have been in a room with me before, you know that I can kind of get going. And so they're going to go ahead and try to get out in front of me and let me know if you all have questions. So feel free to throw those in the chat as we go, as we get going, because I definitely do want to make sure that we can meet as many of the needs that you all have today. So as I said, I'm with Headquarters Counseling Center, mostly on the Prevention Resource Center side. So this is really just one of kind of a number of different trainings that we are able to offer through our programming there. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other virtual learning opportunities that we have available for folks as we go through today. So hopes for today that we're going to kind of get really familiar with some risk factors and warning signs for suicide. We'll talk about some intervention strategies or really ways to help, I think is a good way to think about it. And we'll also think about what some protective factors are or some ways that we can go about supporting folks who are at risk for suicide. So I'm going to start this off, I think, with a little bit of a chat question. So feel free to kind of throw into the chat your thoughts about this. Why are we reluctant to talk about suicide? It's been my experience working in this field that I have seen some shift in this. I think that there is definitely still some reluctance to talk about suicide, but kind of a growing recognition that we need to. But just because we know that we need to do something doesn't mean that we feel comfortable doing it or that we do it as often as we should. And so like to just kind of start these presentations by asking folks to kind of take a little look inside, right? We were talking before everyone joined about calling in. So let's kind of look inside and think about, like, what are maybe some of those things that get in the way of feeling like we can bring up suicide. We know that folks very often have had some kind of experience, and we'll get a little bit to the prevalence of suicide thoughts and behaviors in a little bit. But we do know that personal experiences with suicide loss, personal experiences with maybe working with folks or having a loved one who has had some kind of suicide behaviors or suicide thoughts, maybe you're someone who's had your own, that very often those experiences shape how we feel moving forward. And I think sometimes a lot of different feelings can come up with that. Oftentimes we hear folks talk about fear, right? If I am to talk about suicide and, I engage with someone that I care about, or I engage with a student about that, and the answer is yes, what am I going to do? How am I going to be helpful? I think that there may also be some fear that we might put folks at risk if we talk about something as scary as this, really openly. And so I would just, like I said, kind of invite folks to think about maybe where some of how you have encountered the stigma around suicide in your everyday life. So we'll just talk briefly about the suicide statistics, and we're going to kind of take a statewide look at what's going on first. So if anyone signed into the panel that we had with Bert Nash in the Treatment and Recovery Center earlier this week, you saw someone in the Q&A section cite this statistic that we've seen about a 45% increase in Kansas in the number of suicide deaths in the last 20 years. That we're the state with kind of the fifth largest growth in suicide rates across the nation. And we know that here in Douglas County, we have also seen a very significant increase over the last 20 or so years. I believe our stat here is around 80%. And so I don't bring this up to say that that we need to feel hopeless or out of control, or like this is a problem that's growing at such a rate that we can't do anything about it. But just to invite you to start thinking about, while we might be reluctant to think about suicide, we know that it is growing in frequency, which means that it is very real for folks that we care about, for ourselves, for our neighbors, for people who are in our school communities. Also going to draw attention here that when they took a look at suicide deaths across the nation that happened between 2015 and 2017, they found that 54% of the suicide deaths that were investigated, those folks who died did not have a known mental health condition at the time of their death. Why do I bring that up? Well, I think that it goes to this idea that we talked about a little bit earlier, which is that I do truly believe that we all have a part to play in suicide prevention. And I think sometimes that might feel challenging to folks because, it can feel more comfortable to think that suicide prevention is up to someone like me, or up to professionals, folks who are kind of exclusively exclusively trained to support folks who are having mental health challenges or experiencing a mental illness. And it's true, we absolutely need highly trained and qualified mental health professionals to interact with those folks. But what we also know is that we're not going to meet all of them. We're not connected to everyone that we need to be connected with, because there are some folks who are struggling who have not reached out for help, who haven't been identified as needing help. And so it's an opportunity for us to kind of sit back and think, who are they connected to? Maybe they're connected to me, right? Maybe there's a reason that I want to learn a little bit more about what I can do. So the thing that is, I think, been one of the most challenging parts of my job in particular this year is that there has been a noticeable increase in youth suicide over the last several years. We're seeing that certainly on a statewide basis. You can see there on the line graph that I'm showing that increase from 2015 to 2017 in our 10 to 18-year-olds, like we've got a larger slope there than for other age groups. We also see here in Douglas County that it's those younger folks who are also being seen in our emergency departments at the greatest rate for suicide-related and mental health-related emergencies. We know that our youth are struggling, and that is coming out in suicide attempts, behaviors, and sometimes deaths. I'll also say here that we do know that 72% of youth suicides from 2015 to 2017 were identified as male. Now, that's not to say that our female youth aren't struggling, just that when it comes to thinking about, the age or the group that is most often taking lethal steps, it is our males. And so here's a little bit of an insight into why. And like I said, we're going to talk about some things that we can do as far as taking steps for safety in our students or in our youth's lives. And one of the ways that we can do that is by paying attention to how we make environments safe. And so I'm showing here that for youth suicide deaths, almost half, 48% of those suicide deaths involved a firearm. 39% involved suffocation, while only 13 fell into that poisoning category or overdose category. But what I really do want to draw attention to here is the proportion of firearms related deaths. And the reason I'll draw attention to that is that we know that if we are able to reduce the access that young people have to firearms, that can be a life-saving measure. And just a bit more detail here, we know that 60% of the young men who died by suicide did use a firearm, while girls were more likely to use suffocation. So what's going on in our youth's lives? What kinds of factors are we seeing that contribute when a youth dies by suicide? So I'm going to draw attention here to some data that we have from the Kansas Violent Death Reporting System. And this is from their 2015 to 2017 data. So we know that almost 56% of youth who died by suicide had reported getting help for mental health symptoms. And that substance use was cited in about 20% of our youth suicide deaths. Bringing attention to that, because we know that while not all folks are going to have an identified mental health problem, not everyone is going to have a substance use problem, that being on the lookout for these two kinds of risk factors, thinking about how we're supporting folks who are having those experiences, particularly youth, is a life-saving thing. The other part that I want to point out here is the relationship problems section over here. So you'll see that 23% were having intimate partner problems, and 26% were having family relationship problems. We know that those conflictual relationships can be such a devastating thing for youth, that it is very much not just a risk factor, but something that we want to be aware of for all of our all of our youth. That's something we need to take very seriously. So, if I have any educators in the room, then I know that you are aware of the Kansas Communities That Care survey. That's a survey that takes place once a year for our 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. What I'd like to draw attention to here is that survey told us that in Douglas County, almost 40% of all of our students reported that they had symptoms of depression in the last year, and that was in 2021. We know that 17% reported having serious thoughts of suicide, 10% reported making an attempt, and 4% said that they had made that suicide attempt in the last year. Again, I'm not sharing these statistics as a scare tactic. I do share them to say that we have youth in our community right now who are struggling. We have youth right now who are struggling that we don't know who they've made a connection with. And that's why it's so important that I think that we all gather this information so that we do know how to be supportive. I'm going to go ahead and skip over here just to talk a little bit about the LGBTQ plus population. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of great data sources about what is going on with our LGBTQ plus students in Kansas. I think that that's something that we are trying to make progress on, gathering information from that population, but certainly not there yet. So I'm going to share some national level data. Folks really want to get into kind of that equity and data collection, would love to connect around that at sometime outside of the presentation. But the Trevor Project has done a really nice job the last couple of years of doing a youth mental health survey, where they're starting to give us some ideas about, the mental wellness of our LGBTQ plus youth. So one thing that I do want to point out in particular here for 2021 is that we know that the vast majority of youth who were surveyed, 80% said that COVID-19 made their living situation more stressful. And I think that there's a direct line there between the fact that only a third of those youth found their home to be affirming of their LGBTQ plus identities. So we know that there is a direct correlation between well-being and being in an affirming environment. And so one of the things that I invite our participants to think about is how are you interacting with youth, with LGBTQ youth? Are you an educator? Are you in some other kind of youth serving organization? Or are you just someone who loves a youth? But when we create environments that are affirming of those identities, where we respect pronouns, that those are the kinds of protections that we can build for those youth who may or may not find those kinds of environments elsewhere. And we do know how important an affirming home is, and that not everyone is having that. Going to point out that 42% did consider suicide in the last year, and that number increased for youth who identified as transgender or non-binary, again, drawing attention to this risk factor of being in non-affirming environments. Sometimes when we are doing presentations for youth, we'll get questions about some of the information that's out there about the number of LGBTQ plus youth who are dying by suicide. And what we do so try to stress is that we have a real opportunity to create protection there. So here, the other thing that I am going to point out, you'll see that I have a bullet point here that just says that transgender and non-binary youth who had their pronouns respected all of the time by the people they lived with attempted suicide at half the rate of those that did not. I think that that's just so powerful to know. We did a art contest where we invited submissions from youth across the state with our partners at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, the Attorney General's Office, and the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services this last year, and got a lot of great submissions of still art, but also videos. And we had one video that was submitted by Lawrence Youth, actually. And the take home from that video was that respecting pronouns is suicide prevention, and that sentiment could not be more true. Other thing I want to point out to folks is I think that we often think about social media as being kind of 100% not great for youth mental health. I know the Wall Street Journal just put out some really concerning reporting about what Facebook itself knows, right? About the kind of stresses that social media can put on our young people. And like with so much of what we're talking about here, none of this is straightforward, right? Because we know that for some youth, they are finding that social media had a positive effect on their mental health. 96% of the LGBTQ youth who were surveyed said that they had found some positive impacts. And now 88% said it was negative, right? So we've got a mixed bag here that we know that it can act in both ways. And I think as adults in youth's lives, that's an important thing for us to really think about, because I think sometimes it can feel like the answer is let's limit social media, let's take away phones, let's take away those things. And sometimes we know that they are acting as a supportive way of expression or connection for youth. And so I think that we just want to be sure that our approach to social media is as thoughtful as the relationship for youth is nuanced. So let's talk a little bit about risk factors. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I think that there's not a lot that folks have not heard before, right? So we know that men are biologically like more at risk for suicide. They die more often. We know that folks who are more predisposed to impulsive behaviors or aggression are also more at risk for suicide. Just like we know that instances of trauma, whether that's being the victim of physical or sexual abuse or witnessing those things can increase risk for folks. You'll see here that we've also highlighted easy access to lethal methods like firearms and isolation, which I think is one of those things that has been particularly on folks' mind over the past 18 months or so. I know that I have certainly felt less connection over this last 18 months than other times in my life. But we know that all of those things can play into increasing risk. Just as psychiatric illness, medical illnesses, and utilizing drugs and alcohol can also increase risk. I'm again going to point out here that we have substance use showing up again as a contributing risk factor to suicide. Let's see if I can entice you all to chat to me. If you had to guess about the substance that was most often in somebody's system at the time of their death, what would you guess? Thank you, Jeremy. It is in fact alcohol. Alyssa right there with us, right? So we know that alcohol is one, very available, and two, that one of the effects that it has on folks is that it does lower our inhibitions, right? It makes us more likely to do things that we wouldn't normally do. And when we see alcohol added into a mental health crisis or a suicide crisis, we know that things get a lot riskier and a lot more lethal very quickly. So substance use in adults and youth is something that we're always paying attention to. So I think that we will just kind of go directly into thinking about warning signs here. We talked a little bit about risk factors, boxes that folks may check in their lives, but I think that risk factors can't be used as a checklist. What we know is that anybody can become at risk for suicide at any time for any reason, right? That's why we so often really stress that that suicide prevention most effectively happens in the context of relationships. When we have relationships with people, we are more likely to be able to notice when their behavior changes, when something in their life circumstances happens that might place them at risk for suicide or be a warning sign that they're not doing well. I think about the fact that we know that people who are thinking about suicide give warning signs. They may be indirect, they may be more direct. We'll kind of talk about both. But that it's easier, I think, to identify and notice those indirect warning signs when you know someone. I think about myself. I'm someone who lives with anxiety and depression. I'm someone who struggles with that at times more than other times. And folks in my life will tell you that that some of my warning signs that I'm not doing well are that I tend to kind of ghost you, right? Like I may talk about doing an activity with you and then I just kind of don't show up or cancel last minute. Now, folks who also know me know that I'm pretty busy professionally, right? Like I oftentimes have things that are in conflict. And so it's important to me that I have people who know me well enough to know kind of when to check in about those things, because that behavior from me could really mean a couple of different things. So that's we're talking about these significant changes in behavior. And I would say that here, what we're really looking for is when folks aren't acting like themselves. I know that maybe you have a student who always sleeps in class. That might not be a concerning behavior for that student, but if we have someone who's often very alert, engaged, and is now not engaging, is sleeping, that's something that we want to follow up on. Maybe we have someone who never gets themselves together. Like maybe they never wear makeup. They never have on real spiffy clothes for school. And that's a behavior that starts to change and we start to see that is happening. I think that's a reason to check in on someone, even though it may not be a typical signal of distress, right? We just want to look for these significant changes in behavior. Some of the things to, I think, kind of hone in on here are appetite, sleep, concentration, and hygiene. We know that, appetite can increase or decrease. Sleep can increase or decrease. When we start to see that folks are having a difficult time concentrating, that often means that something is going on. Hygiene can fall off, right? We want to be aware of those. We've talked a little bit about alcohol, drugs, and risky behaviors. And now thinking about mood swings, being anxious or agitated. And I think that sometimes this can feel challenging to folks, right? Because I think a part of living in the world of, especially now, this COVID-19 world, I think mood swings, being anxious and feeling agitated sometimes kind of feel like a standard thing. But I think that just because we know that these things may be a more common occurrence doesn't mean that we don't check in on them. And that we don't still, I think, try to take those things seriously and maybe take them as an opportunity to communicate some skills for talking about in a more descriptive way about how we're doing, right? If what we just have is someone that's agitated, we don't know if that's about a suicide crisis, if that's about a mental health crisis, or if that's about something else. But it is an opportunity to check in with someone and maybe provide some opportunity for them to practice communicating what's going on, other than just showing that to us with their behavior. I talked a little bit about myself with withdrawal and isolation. This next one, I really do want to spend some time thinking about here. The truth is that I think that there are a lot of warning signs to try to think about. And I think that it can feel overwhelming to think, like, how am I supposed to remember all of these things, Monica? Or how am I supposed to know if these things are about suicide or about something else? And I do think that there are some kind of categories of behaviors or of experiences that I would encourage you to think about, and to kind of follow up on and take those as an invitation to find out a little bit more. And one of those categories is like when folks experience a loss. Now, what I want to say here is that I think loss does not look the same for everybody. We categorize different things as losses. Losses can be really tangible, right? Maybe I did not get the scholarship that I applied for. Maybe my parents divorced, right? Like there's something very like discrete that we can point to that feels very logical as a loss. And I think that sometimes losses can feel more like esoteric, maybe like we're just not like, just have to pay a little bit more attention to them, right? So one of the things that I think about is kind of a loss of reputation or a loss of identity. So, you know, we often, I think about the fact that perfectionism can be a risk factor for some of our youth when it comes to suicide. And one way that we may see that, see a loss experienced for that kind of personality is by not performing as well as they wanted to, even though from the outside or to another student or to a family member, that still seems like they have achieved well, right? So I think about myself, I also have some of these kind of perfectionist tendencies to my personality. You know, so I was the high school junior who took the ACT 3 times, trying to improve my score by 1 point. And it was pretty baffling to my parents, like how disappointed I was the first 2 times I took it and didn't get that score that I wanted, and how hard I was on myself that I had not been able to achieve that score. And, you know, I think that they were looking from the outside going like, this is great, Monica, this is fine. What's the problem here? And so I don't know that they necessarily identified that for me as something that I was really beating myself up about, and yet it was. And so I think, again, it goes back to these relationships. Like we know that there are students for whom a B is going to be a sense of failure, and for some that it's going to be a sense of victory. You know, I also think here about disciplinary actions that may or may not happen at school, or academic problems that may start to be happening. So if we know that as a result of some behavior that students are going to be losing some kind of privilege or some kind of activity that they find a lot of joy in or a lot of connection in, that is, again, I think a kind of loss that we want to be aware of. You know, we're not necessarily in the habit of recommending that schools send students home alone after those kinds of experiences. Next category I'm going to encourage you all to think about is this idea of pain or experiencing painful feelings. You know, I so often find, you know, from the folks that call into the hotline, from participants in trainings that we've done, and from my work in other areas of mental health, that suicide is so very often about pain and not having, really just feeling like you're out of options to not experience that pain anymore. You know, I think that it can feel, or it can be common to encounter folks who may describe the act of suicide as selfish, or short-sighted. And one of the things that I really struggle with there is that I know from talking to folks in crisis that in that moment, right, it does not feel necessarily like it is about them, right? It may feel like they've become a burden on other people, and that's a burden that they're now relieving other folks of, or may feel like the only option that they have to end the kind of pain that they're in, which is why I want us to try to be alert to when folks are experiencing pain, and knowing that a lot of times behaviors about suicide can be about either trying to express the pain that they're in, or perhaps avoid the pain that they're feeling. You know, one of the experiences that we have very often with new counselors to our hotline is the experience of the callers who call in and are very angry on the phone. Just yelling a lot, feeling very angry. And I think that catches folks off guard because they probably have an idea, whether they knew it or not, that folks who were thinking about suicide would be sad and depressed. But we see that anger so often goes hand in hand with thinking about suicide. And it brings me back to this idea of pain that we're not always very good at expressing when we're experiencing psychological or emotional pain, and that can really come out as anger and irritability. Luckily for you all, we're virtual, and so I won't make you raise your hand for this, but my guess is that I am not the only one who, like, when I've had a bad day or when I'm feeling just like generally stressed and overwhelmed, that one of the ways that comes out is like I may just like pick a fight with my husband for no reason, or get mad at him for something that is seemingly innocuous, right? And again, I think that comes from a place where sometimes it's just easier to express those negative feelings that I'm having in that way than to have a real sit down about what my emotions are. So would invite folks to think about that anger as a way that people are expressing pain, and looking for other ways that folks may be expressing that emotional pain or physical pain, right? Also, in inviting you to think about behaviors that we engage in that help us not feel pain, right? I think sometimes that looks like substance use, alcohol use for people. For some folks, that may look like throwing themselves into a project or into work or into some other commitment, but some of those kind of ways that we try to avoid having to feel the difficult feelings. All of those are things that I would like us to start thinking about as being possibly connected to suicide and something that we want to think about following up on. Now, there are things that are much more straightforward, right? Things that we're absolutely going to follow up on anytime that they happen. And one of those is talking or writing about suicide. I probably have not gone to any school where I haven't been told that the English department or the English teachers or the creative writing teachers are some of the teachers who seek out the most information about mental health symptoms or about suicide crisis and how to help, or is the department that is most often referring to social work and school counselors. And I think that's, because when we give kids an opportunity to express themselves creatively, we may see that they start to write or write about suicide or write about death in some of those things. And those are pieces that we want to follow up on. What is being expressed here? What's going on? We may hear students talk about suicide. I'll never forget getting a question from a cheerleading coach at a high school outside of Douglas County. And, she showed up to one of the trainings that we did and said, sometimes it feels like my girls are saying that they're just going to kill themselves anytime they miss a stunt, anytime they miss a trick. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. Because I think it can feel hard to take that seriously every time it happens. And that's what we show up and say, right? We have to always take it seriously. And, I think that sometimes it can feel tricky for folks because it's like, is this person joking, right? Is that the way that this phrase is being used? And what we ended up talking about is like, what a great opportunity for some education about how much we care about the youth in our lives, right? Like when I hear you say things like that, I really want to make sure you're okay. And, if it's that you're feeling disappointed, like, let's talk about some other ways to talk about that other than suicide, because I do need to take this seriously anytime I hear you say it. I think the other thing that comes up here, though, to be honest, I'm kind of hearing this, I think, less and less often, is when we think about finding comments about suicide or finding comments about death on social media platforms. And so, I think that the primary take home here used to be like, yes, we have to take that seriously. Like social media is real life. And so that's something that we need to follow up on. Our social media channels, at this point, I think all of them have some guidance that you can follow for reporting those kinds of statements so that folks can be followed up with. You know, and I think that one of the other ways that I hear folks think about this is that sometimes communications about feeling depressed or thinking about death or wanting to die on social media, we can almost get to a point of feeling desensitized to it because maybe it happens so often from particular people that maybe ways that the youth in your life are feeling about some of their friends. Like, I know when I have to take this seriously, like I can tell the difference between when this person is just saying it and when I really need to be worried. And I think that, again, that those are just some nice opportunities that we have to talk with youth about the fact that we do want to know about those things when that's what they're reading on social media, when that's the kinds of things that their friends are saying, that we do want to be able to be a support for them through that, because that's a heavy thing to know and experience as just youth or even as adults. My mail just arrived, and so my dog is also going to join us for a little bit, but we'll hope that he moves on from that relatively quickly. So any expressions of hopelessness about the future, we also always want to take seriously, and then always encourage folks to think about noticing any preparations that may be being made for death. So here we're thinking about giving away of treasured belongings, writing a suicide note, searching for means, those kinds of things we're always going to follow up on. So we've talked about some of these things already, right? These are the kinds of events that we may notice that we do want to follow up on. So what do we do if you've noticed a warning sign? Well, for any district, school district employees that we have here, like I would refer you to the protocols that exist within your school system. You know, I know that I saw Jose Cornejo sign on to this particular webinar, and the USD 497 district protocol is something that he and I have looked at a number of times. Like they've done a nice job of outlining where folks can go to get support if they have noticed these warning signs, that we have good mental health team availability in our schools or in our school buildings, or by being able to contact the district office and being connected with someone who can be helpful. If you're in a different school district that I haven't seen your protocol, I would encourage you to be following up with the social work staff or the RAP staff or your administration to make sure that you are clear on what can be done, but really thinking about wanting to get notification to those folks. But so what do we do to help, right? Like beyond just kind of following this district protocol. And so I think that there are ways that we work upstream of these thoughts, like in the prevention side. I think that there are things that we do to intervene, which we're going to talk about here, and also responsibilities that we can look at to follow up after someone makes an attempt or a death happens. So I'm going to, unless I hear differently in the chat, I'm going to talk about kind of some of the prevention pieces relatively quickly. And the reason I'm going to do that is I know that Lydia Fouquet and Meg Hasselman are going to be doing a really great presentation, I think it's sometime in October, on some of the opportunities that we have for working with youth on our upstream prevention efforts when it comes to increasing protective factors. Lydia is telling me in the chat that it is next Tuesday. She should also throw probably the name of that that presentation in there, because I'm very excited to hear them talk about the exciting work that they're doing. But in Douglas County, we are seeing more and more implementation of a program that I think has an excellent evidence base and just makes a ton of sense, called Sources of Strength. And that's what they're going to be talking with you all about next Tuesday. So if that's something that you have a chance to attend, I highly encourage it. Because one of the things that does is that it promotes community connectedness, which is one of these prevention efforts that I think is really, really important to think about because one of the most powerful things that we can do to prevent youth suicide, to prevent adult suicide, is to think about how we are fostering strong connections in our community. Youth to adult connections, youth to youth connections, neighbor to neighbor connections. And doing things like this, learning what we can do. So how do we build protective factors? You know, maybe you have a sources of strength group that's getting off the ground in your school, or you know someone who is getting connected to that, but that's not a formal part that you're going to play in that. So what can you do? Well, I think that there are a lot of different ways that we can promote building protective factors in the school environment. I don't know if I have any Lady Gaga fans with us today. I mean, I can tell you that I am one. She has her Born This Way Foundation that has really taken its focus on thinking about what fosters mental wellness and what is the connection between kindness and kind environments and mental wellness. And they've really identified a few different factors that they find to be important. And I'm going to speed up here. But one of those is that creative activities help to support mental wellness and just creating a kind environment. So how do we do that? What was going on in schools that kids identified as kind? You know, and this slide simultaneously gives me so much hope, and also I think just kind of breaks my heart, because I do see just the kind of low-hanging fruit that we have that can help students to feel connected and seen. Because one of the biggest things was that their teachers said hi to them. Their teachers said goodbye to them, right? They acknowledged that their students were there. They were provided some information on mental health. And their classmates made an effort to include students who were maybe different or outside of the some of the more traditional, I think, cliques. And so, you know, that idea of inclusion, that idea of being seen, that idea of being educated can be really, really powerful. So again, encourage you guys to show up on Tuesday and to really think about building some of these protective factors through that program. But for right now, since we have about 12 minutes left, I'd like to take us through some real basics and brief ideas about how to interact with a student, youth, or person should you become concerned that they're at risk of suicide. So we talked about these warning signs, we talked about these risk factors, and you're like, great, Monica, so then what do I do? And at this point, I like to think that we've been out in the community long enough saying that we have to talk directly about suicide, that is the way that we build safety for folks, that's not going to be news to anybody here. Because that's exactly what we're going to ask you to do. We're going to ask you to acknowledge that you may be the person who noticed, right? We're not going to hope that somebody else noticed one of these warning signs. We're going to acknowledge that we did experience some concern, and we're going to follow up on that. How are we going to do that? We're going to share why we're concerned. We're going to ask directly about suicide. We're going to make the environment safe. We're going to listen, which is huge. And hopefully we're going to connect somebody with the next helper. So when I say share specific concerns and ask directly about suicide, I think that those two steps go together. If you take away nothing else from this presentation, take away that it is entirely safe to ask the question, are you thinking about suicide, or are you thinking about killing yourself? And that when we say ask directly, that is as directly as we're talking about, right? That we want to make sure that everyone in the conversation knows what we're talking about. We think that asking directly does a couple of different things, but one of the most important things that it does is it sends the signal to the person that you're concerned about that you are not afraid to have a very serious conversation about suicide if that's what's happening. And I would like to encourage you to think about why do you have to ask? Why can't you just wait for the person to tell you that they need some help, right? Like, why do you have to be the one to ask? And my guess is that you don't have to think very hard to think back to a time where there was something that you were struggling with that was difficult for you to bring up. And I think that oftentimes for folks who are thinking about suicide, this is that kind of thing, that it can be difficult to know who it's safe to talk to about. It can be difficult to think that anybody is prepared to have that heavy of a conversation, or it can be difficult to admit to yourself that that's truly how far your thoughts have gone. And so I want to assure you that it's safe to ask, and I want to assure you that people will say yes. That there are folks who are going to say yes, that that's what's on their mind, and then be willing to have a conversation about it. And so that may sound like, I've noticed that you're not as engaged with your friends as you used to be, and you seem to be kind of withdrawn, and I don't really know what's going on, but I know that sometimes when folks start to act like they're disconnected, it may mean that they're thinking about suicide. Is that going on for you? So Ray is sharing in the chat that she asks the questions on all intakes, and most kids are relieved to be asked, and parents are surprised at their response. Yes, yes, and yes, Ray. I will say that I think that parents are often surprised that their kids will answer the question, and that they're surprised that we're being that direct. But I think that it's important to communicate to parents in this moment that we have to know the answer to this question, right? That it can feel scary and big, but if we don't ask, then their kid is just going to be alone having those thoughts. And that is absolutely the riskiest thing that could happen. So let's say that you have asked about suicide. Now what, right? The answer was yes. I think that sometimes people feel like what's next is that they have to fix it, right? My guess is that I've got some fixers in the audience. Again, if you were in person, this is when I would ask you to self-identify as one, but I'll self-identify for you. I love to be able to provide some problem-solving answers for folks. It feels really good to be helpful in that way. And I think that at the start of a conversation about suicide, it can be really tempting to try to figure out what problem needs to be solved. But that's a lot of pressure and isn't really what's called for here. What we really want to do is to be in a situation where we can become a sounding board for the person who's thinking about suicide, where we can become a sounding board that allows them to start releasing some of the pain that they've been experiencing probably all alone. And the way that we do that is by asking, so you've been thinking about suicide, what's going on that's got you there, right? Do you know when you started thinking about this and why? And starting to give an opportunity to tell that story really builds, I think, the willingness to start thinking, for the person to start thinking about another alternative to their situation than death. And so listening is just so key. Now, I am not asking anyone to be a therapist here, right? Like, I understand that some of you in this room probably are, and others of you are not. You're just here thinking about how can I be a support to folks when it does come time to have a conversation about suicide. You don't need to take yourself outside of your comfort zone. What I think we're doing is we're asking folks to listen to the point that they can start to hear some signs of hope or some signs of uncertainty, and then encouraging the person that we're talking to, encouraging that youth to start identifying someone else that we can pull into this conversation. If this is a school on school property, like I said, you very likely have a protocol about who you need to go to next. And so encourage you to follow up with that. Some other things to think about. How are we going to communicate with parents about this behavior? What kind of mental health resources do we have in the community? You know, I think that Bert Nash is an excellent resource here in our community. Our RAP workers at the schools are an excellent resource. The KSPHQ hotline is absolutely a connection that you can make to help find some next steps. And really thinking about who do we have that can start to create a safety plan with students. Yeah, like Ray, I'm loving this, like talking about, I'm on this journey with you and we're going to keep talking. Yeah, we're going to keep talking so that you know that you're not alone and so that we can figure out what we need to do next with folks. So, you know, we are kind of towards the end of our time here. And I think that what I would like us all to kind of walk away with is none of us have to be in this work alone, right? Like there are people who can be helpful in finding next steps and connections to next resources. We have those resources in our communities, and we also have the opportunity to make sure that no one in our community, whether that's our school community, our church community, our workout community, whatever that is, no one has to be alone with these thoughts and with these struggles. That we have an opportunity, and we don't need very much training, but really just a willingness to connect and to be a connection for someone in order to be helpful with somebody in crisis. And I think that takes me almost up to the very end of my time. I think I have 3 minutes, Lydia. And so if folks do have any kind of last minute questions that they'd like to throw in the chat, I could probably answer one quickly. Well, so I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I will just say thank you all for being here. You know, I have worked in suicide prevention full-time for a number of years now, and I won't lie to you all, like there are days that it is challenging to work in this field. You know, I think that we are connecting to a lot of folks who are experiencing a lot of pain and risky situations, and oftentimes are feeling really isolated. And there are times that feels hard as a professional. And then there are days that I get to show up and do things like this, where I look at a participant list that is full of folks who have taken an hour out of their lunch break when they could have been watching TikTok videos, Lydia, or looking at memes of baby animals, or talking to their families, or doing any number of things. And instead what you did is you showed up here to either refresh yourself on good suicide intervention, to test your limits a little bit, to stretch a little bit about what you can know and what you can do. But seeing folks show up for things like this is always very, very hope-giving for me and life-affirming for me. So thank you all so much for your time today. And if there's any way that myself or my organization can be a resource for you as you think about what part you want to play in suicide prevention, I do hope that you'll reach out.
Monica, thank you so much. That was a really incredible hour that we just got to spend with you. It's really great to hear a little bit about your experiences and also get this information at a time when it feels really critical to have these tools in our toolbox. So thank you for giving us an hour of your time today. We really appreciate you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Make sure you come back for week 3 of the Douglas County Behavioral Health Prevention Summit next Tuesday and Thursday, again at noon. On Tuesday, as Monica mentioned, Meg Hasselman and I will be presenting on sources of strength in Douglas County. And then Thursday, you'll hear from some DECA folks on drug trends and prevention efforts in Douglas County. So lots of good stuff coming up next week. Make sure you come back for week 3. But in the meantime, have a great weekend and a great day, and we'll see you back next week. Thanks, everybody.